The morning sun streamed through the large windows of JFK International Airport as a well-dressed family of four made their way through the bustling terminal. The father, wearing a crisp navy suit that spoke of quiet success, guided their luggage cart while keeping an eye on their two children. His wife walked beside him, her elegant yet understated dress and minimal jewelry reflecting refined taste rather than flashy wealth. As they passed the duty-free shops, the mother noticed a small group of travelers doing double takes in their direction. She'd seen that look countless times before. The slight narrowing of eyes, the quick glances at their designer luggage, the subtle whispers behind hands. After 20 years of success in corporate America, they'd grown used to being one of the few black families in many high-end spaces, though the weight of those stares never truly lightened. Their younger child tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking if they could stop at the candy shop they'd just passed. "After we check in, sweetheart," she promised, smoothing down his collar. The older child, absorbed in a book about aerospace engineering, barely looked up as they navigated through the crowded terminal. The father checked his watch. They were right on schedule, as usual. Running a multinational corporation had taught him the value of precision timing. Their first-class tickets to Los Angeles were booked on the airline's premium morning flight, the one preferred by business executives and celebrities seeking comfort and privacy. As they approached the check-in counter, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The staff member behind the counter was helping another family, tourists in matching t-shirts, and her cheerful demeanor was evident from several feet away. However, when she spotted the approaching family, her smile flickered just slightly, her posture stiffening almost imperceptibly. The father and mother exchanged a knowing glance. These micro-reactions had become a familiar dance over the years. Sometimes they wondered if they should dress more extravagantly, more obviously wealthy, to avoid these situations. But why should they have to? Their success spoke through their quiet confidence, not through flashy displays. The younger child, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents, began telling his sister about the planes he could see through the massive windows. His excitement was contagious, and several nearby travelers smiled at his enthusiastic commentary about wing designs and engine types, a passion he'd inherited from his parents' involvement in the aviation industry. As they waited in line, the mother observed other first-class passengers arriving, executives in expensive suits, a famous actor trying to remain inconspicuous behind sunglasses, a tech entrepreneur she recognized from magazine covers. Each was welcomed with immediate deference by the staff. She took a deep breath, knowing what likely awaited them at the counter. The father placed their passports and boarding passes on the counter with a practiced smile. He'd learned long ago that maintaining composure in these situations was not just about personal dignity. It was about setting an example for his children. After all, they were helping to fund this very airline's operations, though nobody at this counter knew that yet. Their check-in process was about to begin, and with it, an encounter that would soon go viral across social media and change airline policies forever. But for now, they stood together as a family, poised and patient, their presence challenging assumptions with every passing moment. The morning sunlight continued to stream through those high airport windows, illuminating a scene that was about to become much more than just another day of air travel. The first-class boarding line was beginning to form, a mix of business travelers tapping away on their phones and wealthy tourists chatting quietly among themselves. The family took their place in line, their boarding passes clearly marked with Group 1 priority boarding. Their children stood close, the younger one still excitedly pointing out different aircraft models through the terminal windows, while the older one finally looked up from her book about aerospace engineering. That's when they first noticed her, a flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a crisp uniform, watching the boarding line with hawk-like attention. She had been warmly greeting other first-class passengers, but her smile vanished when she spotted the family. The father felt his wife's hand gently squeeze his arm, their years together having taught them to recognize these moments before they even began. "Excuse me," the flight attendant called out, her voice carrying across the gate area. I believe this line is for first-class boarding only. She emphasized the words first class as if they were written in gold, her eyes scanning the family's casual yet expensive clothing with obvious doubt. The father stepped forward, his voice calm and measured as he'd learned to keep it during countless similar encounters. Yes, we know. We have first-class tickets. He held out their boarding passes, which the flight attendant snatched rather than took. Other passengers began to notice the exchange. A businessman in an expensive suit lowered his phone, watching with a frown. A couple who had been chatting quietly fell silent. The air grew thick with uncomfortable tension. The flight attendant studied their boarding passes with exaggerated scrutiny, flipping them over and holding them up to the light as if checking for counterfeits. These seem unusual, she said, though they were identical to every other first-class boarding pass issued that day. Let me just verify these with my supervisor. The younger child tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mom, why is she being mean? He whispered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Several people shifted uncomfortably, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones, though they were clearly watching the scene unfold. The flight attendant returned with their boarding passes, but didn't hand them back immediately. Are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in economy? She suggested, her voice dripping with false concern. First class can be quite formal. The implication in her tone was clear as crystal. The mother spoke up this time, her voice steady but firm. We're quite comfortable in first class, thank you. We fly this route frequently. She held out her hand for their boarding passes, maintaining direct eye contact with the flight attendant. A few more passengers had joined the line behind them, creating an audience for this unnecessary trauma. Some were recording discreetly on their phones, their faces showing a mix of discomfort and disapproval, though it wasn't clear whether that disapproval was directed at the family or the flight attendant's behavior. The older child had finally put down her book entirely, her expression showing she understood exactly what was happening. She stood a little straighter, mirroring her parents' dignity in the face of this treatment. The younger one had stopped talking about airplanes and was now pressing closer to his father's side. The flight attendant made a show of checking their tickets one more time before reluctantly handing them back. Very well, she said, her tone making it clear she still had doubts. But I'll need to keep an eye on your seating arrangements. She emphasized the last words as if they were a warning. Little did she know, this attempt to keep an eye on things was about to backfire in a way that would make headlines and change the airline industry's approach to customer service forever. The family stood their ground, their quiet dignity a stark contrast to the flight attendant's barely concealed hostility. The next few minutes would prove to be a lesson that no one at that gate would ever forget. The tension at the boarding gate was reaching a boiling point. As the family made their way down the jet bridge, the flight attendant followed closely behind them, her heels clicking against the floor with determined purpose. Other first-class passengers trailed behind, many of them now openly watching the situation unfold with concerned expressions. I just want to make absolutely certain, the flight attendant announced loudly, her voice echoing in the confined space of the jet bridge, that you understand the standards we maintain in our first-class cabin. She rushed ahead of the family to block their path, standing with her arms crossed. We have many distinguished passengers who expect a certain atmosphere. The father took a deep breath, one that his wife recognized as his way of maintaining composure. We're quite familiar with first-class standards, he replied calmly. As I mentioned, we fly this route frequently. His voice was steady, but those close enough could hear the weariness in it. The fatigue of having to constantly prove one's right to occupy certain spaces. Their younger child was now clinging to his mother's hand, his earlier excitement about airplanes completely forgotten. The older child stood tall beside her father, her face showing a maturity beyond her years as she watched this all too familiar scene play out. Perhaps I should explain our first-class policies, the flight attendant continued, pulling out a manual from her uniform pocket. Several passengers behind them shifted uncomfortably, checking their watches and muttering about delays. The flight attendant began reading policies about dress codes and behavior expectations, despite the family being impeccably dressed and perfectly well-mannered. "Ma'am," the mother interjected softly but firmly, "we're holding up the boarding process. We have our boarding passes, our seats are assigned, and we'd like to get settled before takeoff." Her calm diplomacy made the flight attendant's behavior appear even more unreasonable by contrast. A businessman standing behind them cleared his throat. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. More phones came out, recording the incident. Someone in the back of the line mentioned something about social media and discrimination. The flight attendant's face flushed red, but she stood her ground. "I'm simply trying to ensure that our premium cabin maintains its exclusive nature. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable if I found you seats together in economy. I'm sure our economy passengers would be more welcoming." The father shook his head slightly, reaching into his pocket. "I don't think that will be necessary. However, I do need to make a quick phone call." He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. The flight attendant's expression shifted to one of smug satisfaction, clearly believing she had won. "Of course," she said with false sweetness, "you'll need to call someone to help sort this out. I can recommend our customer service line, though they'll tell you the same thing. First class has certain standards." The mother exchanged a knowing look with her husband as he dialed a number she recognized well. Their children, who had seen this scenario play out before in restaurants, hotels, and other establishments, stood quietly beside them. The older child even had a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, knowing what was about to happen. As the father raised the phone to his ear, passengers behind them continued filming. The flight attendant stood triumphantly, clipboard in hand, clearly expecting this call to validate her actions. The tension in the jet bridge was thick enough to cut with a knife, but the family remained perfectly composed. What happened next would not only change this flight attendant's entire perspective, but would also trigger a chain of events leading to major changes in airline industry training and policies. The father's next words into the phone would turn the situation completely on its head, though the flight attendant didn't know it yet. She was about to learn a valuable lesson about assumptions, respect, and the true meaning of premium status. The atmosphere in the jet bridge grew even more tense as the father spoke quietly into his phone. "Yes, this is the owner speaking. Could you please send the regional director to gate A7? We seem to be having a situation that requires immediate attention." His voice was calm, but carried a weight of authority that made several nearby passengers exchange glances. The flight attendant's smug smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Sir, I don't know who you're pretending to call, but this is only delaying the inevitable. You're holding up the entire boarding process." She turned to the other passengers, clearly seeking support. "I apologize to everyone for this delay, but we must maintain our standards." The mother had taken out her phone as well, quietly filming the interaction. Their younger child whispered, "Mom, why won't she let us on the plane?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that made several nearby passengers look down at their feet uncomfortably. The older child touched her brother's shoulder. "Don't worry," she said, just loud enough for those around them to hear. "Dad's calling his employee." The flight attendant let out a short, dismissive laugh at this comment, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. More passengers had gathered in the jet bridge, creating an unwanted audience for this confrontation. The clicking sounds of phone cameras became more frequent. Someone in the back of the line said, "This is going viral for sure." Another person muttered, "She's going to regret this." "Look," the flight attendant said, her voice rising with frustration, "I've worked this route for 8 years. I know all our regular first-class passengers, and I've never seen you before." She straightened her uniform badge, using it as a symbol of her authority. "Now I can help you find seats in economy, or you can wait here for security." The father ended his call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. "We'll wait," he said simply. His wife squeezed his hand, a gesture of support they'd shared through many similar moments over the years. Their children stood close, watching and learning how to handle discrimination with dignity. The flight attendant began tapping her foot impatiently. Security will just tell you the same thing. First class has certain expectations, certain standards that we must. She stopped mid-sentence as rapid footsteps approached from the terminal. A man in a crisp suit was hurrying down the jet bridge, slightly out of breath. Behind him, 2 more airline officials followed quickly. The flight attendant's face showed the first real signs of concern as she recognized the regional director's badge and insignia. The businessman who had spoken up earlier now had his phone raised, clearly recording. Other passengers had stopped pretending to be occupied with their tickets or phones, openly watching the scene unfold. The younger child had moved closer to his sister, who put a protective arm around him. The flight attendant straightened up, preparing to explain her actions to her superiors. She began, "Sir, I was just explaining to these people that our first-class cabin has certain standards." But the regional director walked right past her, his face a mask of concern and embarrassment. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones and shared thousands of times across social media platforms. The flight attendant was about to learn a lesson about assumptions that would change not only her perspective, but also influence airline policies across the industry. The next few moments would transform this uncomfortable confrontation into a powerful teaching moment about prejudice, privilege, and the danger of jumping to conclusions. The regional director rushed forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and concern. "Sir," he addressed the father, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent jet bridge, "I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this situation." He turned to glare at the flight attendant, who was watching the scene with growing confusion. "I got here as quickly as I could," the director continued, straightening his tie nervously. "When our majority shareholder calls about a boarding issue, we take it very seriously." The word shareholder seemed to echo in the confined space of the jet bridge. Several passengers gasped audibly. The flight attendant's face went through a remarkable transformation, from confusion to disbelief, then to horror as understanding dawned. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly on the floor. "Majority shareholder," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," the father replied calmly. "My company acquired a controlling interest in this airline's parent corporation last year. We've been implementing changes gradually, though clearly." He glanced meaningfully at the flight attendant. "Some areas still need attention." The younger child tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, what's a shareholder?" he asked innocently. His older sister leaned down and whispered, "It means Dad owns the airline." The flight attendant swayed slightly, reaching for the wall to steady herself. Phones were still recording as the regional director continued, "Sir, your family's seats are ready, and the cabin crew has been notified. Would you like me to arrange different flight attendants for your journey?" Several passengers murmured in approval at this suggestion. The mother stepped forward. "That won't be necessary," she said firmly. "We don't want anyone to lose their job today. What we want is change." Her words carried a weight that made everyone in the jet bridge fall silent again. The flight attendant had turned a shade paler, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. I didn't know," she stammered. "I never thought." Her voice trailed off as she realized how hollow these words sounded. "That's exactly the problem," the father said, his voice gentle but firm. "You never thought to question your own assumptions. You saw our skin color and made immediate judgments about our right to be in first class." The truth of his words hung heavy in the air. A businessman near the back of the line called out, "This is exactly why we need more diversity in corporate America." Several others nodded in agreement. The older child stood a little straighter, pride evident in her expression as she watched her parents handle the situation with such grace. The regional director was already on his phone, likely dealing with the PR nightmare that was unfolding on social media. Passengers were still recording, their phones capturing every moment of this unexpected lesson in prejudice and power. The flight attendant finally found her voice again. "Sir, ma'am, I am so sorry. I never meant to." She stopped, realizing that intentions didn't matter as much as actions. Tears were forming in her eyes, but they weren't tears of self-pity. They were tears of genuine shame and realization. The father looked at his watch, then at his children. "We should board now," he said calmly. "But tomorrow, I'd like to have a meeting about implementing new training programs." He turned to the flight attendant. "And I hope you'll be part of that conversation. Real change happens through education, not punishment." As the family finally moved toward their seats, other passengers began to applaud, not just for the revelation of ownership, but for the dignity and grace with which the family had handled the entire situation. This moment would soon become a viral symbol of the ongoing need for change in corporate America, and a reminder that appearances never tell the whole story. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded quickly. As the family settled into their first-class seats, the regional director pulled the flight attendant aside near the cockpit. Her face was still pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she wiped away tears. The other crew members kept their distance, though they couldn't help stealing glances at the unfolding scene. "I've never been so ashamed," the flight attendant whispered, her voice shaking. "I've worked in aviation for 15 years, and I thought I was one of the good ones. I never realized I was carrying these prejudices." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet the director's eyes. Meanwhile, in first class, other passengers were approaching the family to express their support. A well-dressed elderly woman stopped by their seats and touched the mother's shoulder. "The way you handled that was remarkable," she said softly. "My grandson is mixed race, and I pray he grows up in a better world than this." The younger child was finally getting his excitement back, pressed against the window to watch the ground crew work. His sister had pulled out her aerospace book again, but kept glancing at her parents with obvious pride. The father was on his phone, already sending emails about implementing new company-wide training programs. Back near the galley, the regional director was handling damage control. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications as videos of the incident spread across social media platforms. The airline's PR team was already drafting statements, but they waited for the father's approval before releasing anything. After all, he was their boss. "Sir," a flight attendant from economy class approached the family cautiously. "I just wanted to say, what happened was wrong. Many of us want to do better. We want to learn." Her sincerity was evident in her voice, and the mother nodded appreciatively at her words. The original flight attendant remained in the galley, certain she was about to lose her job. She jumped when her phone buzzed. It was an email from HR. With trembling fingers, she opened it, expecting the worst. Instead, she found an invitation to meet with the airline's board of directors the following week to discuss her role in developing new training protocols. A business executive across the aisle leaned over to the father. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, he said quietly. "I've seen this kind of thing happen too many times. But I've never seen it handled with such grace, or such potential for real change." The mother was writing notes on her tablet, already outlining points for tomorrow's meeting. "It's not enough to just punish people," she explained to her daughter, who was listening intently. "Real change comes from education, understanding, and giving people the chance to learn from their mistakes." In the cockpit, the pilots had been briefed about the situation. The captain made a point of leaving his post briefly to personally welcome the family aboard. "Your company's ownership has already brought positive changes to our airline," he said sincerely. "I have a feeling this incident will lead to even more important ones." Social media was exploding with various versions of the video. But unlike many viral confrontations, this one was being praised for its resolution. Comments poured in about the family's dignity, the power of responding to discrimination with grace, and the importance of creating change rather than just punishment. The flight attendant finally gathered her courage and approached the family one more time. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I know sorry isn't enough," she said. "But I want you to know that I'm ready to learn, to change, and to help others learn from my mistake." The father nodded, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "Let's talk about how we can make that happen." The next morning, the airline's main conference room was packed with executives, HR representatives, and board members. The father sat at the head of the table, his wife beside him, as they prepared to discuss the changes needed in the company. The flight attendant from yesterday's incident sat nervously at the other end, still amazed she hadn't been fired. "Let's be clear," the father began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "Yesterday's incident wasn't just about one person or one family. It's about a deeper issue that affects our entire industry." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. "And we have a unique opportunity to lead by example." On the large screen behind him, social media statistics scrolled past. The videos of yesterday's confrontation had gone viral, but surprisingly, most comments focused on the positive outcome and potential for change. #BetterTogether and #LearnAndGrow were trending, with millions sharing their own stories of discrimination in the travel industry. The flight attendant raised her hand hesitantly. When the father nodded, she stood up, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent the entire night thinking about my actions," she said. "I realized I've probably done this to other passengers before, maybe not as obviously, but through small actions and assumptions. I want to be part of making sure this never happens again." The mother opened her laptop and shared her screen. "We've outlined a comprehensive training program," she explained. "But we want input from everyone, including those who've experienced bias firsthand." She nodded to several staff members of color who had been invited to share their perspectives. A young gate agent spoke up. "Sometimes it's not just the obvious discrimination," she said. "It's the small things. The extra ID checks, the suspicious looks, the assumptions about which cabin someone belongs in. We need to address all of it." The flight attendant was taking notes furiously. "Could we create a mentorship program?" she suggested. "Pair newer employees with those who've experienced these issues. Real stories make more impact than just reading training manuals." The father smiled approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need," he said. "This isn't about punishment. It's about growth, understanding, and real change." He turned to the HR director. "I want this training to be mandatory for every employee, from baggage handlers to board members." Throughout the day, more ideas flowed. Someone suggested creating a diversity council with representatives from every department. Another proposed regular workshops where employees could share experiences and learn from each other. The flight attendant, growing more confident, suggested incorporating real-world scenarios into training sessions. "What about the children?" someone asked. "How do we make sure they feel welcome?" The mother shared how their own children had learned to handle discrimination with dignity, but agreed that no child should have to develop such resilience. Plans were made to create special training for staff working with young passengers. By late afternoon, the framework for a comprehensive change was taking shape. The flight attendant, who had arrived expecting punishment, was now leading a discussion about subtle forms of bias she'd recognized in her own behavior. Her willingness to learn and change had transformed her from a symbol of discrimination into an advocate for improvement. "This is just the beginning," the father announced as the meeting wound down. "Real change takes time, commitment, and continuous effort. But today, we've taken the first step." He looked at the flight attendant, who now sat straighter, her earlier shame replaced by determination to be part of the solution. As people filed out of the conference room, many stopped to share their own stories or offer suggestions. The flight attendant stayed behind, reviewing her notes and adding more ideas. She looked up as the father approached her desk. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me the chance to be better." "Thank you," he replied, "for showing us that change is possible when people are willing to learn." It was clear that this incident, painful as it had been, was becoming the catalyst for meaningful transformation in the airline industry. 3 months after the incident, the airline's main training center buzzed with activity. The flight attendant who had once blocked a family from boarding now stood at the front of a packed classroom, sharing her story with a new group of employees. Her voice was strong and clear, no longer carrying the shame of that day, but rather the conviction of someone committed to making things right. "I thought I knew what good customer service meant," she told the group. "But I was carrying biases I didn't even realize I had." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about discrimination in the travel industry. "Our airline is changing that, one person at a time." Down the hall, the mother led another session with senior staff members. They watched real-world scenarios played out by actors, stopping to discuss subtle forms of bias that many had never noticed before. "It's not always about obvious discrimination," she explained. "Sometimes it's about the small assumptions we make without thinking." The training program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Other airlines had begun sending representatives to learn from their approach. The father's company had created a special department dedicated to diversity and inclusion training, headed by experts in the field who understood both the airline industry and the importance of treating every passenger with respect. In the employee break room, stories of positive change were already emerging. A gate agent shared how she'd caught herself making assumptions about a passenger's seat assignment and immediately corrected her behavior. A baggage handler described intervening when he witnessed another employee showing subtle bias. The flight attendant's role had evolved, too. Instead of working regular flights, she now split her time between flying and training. Her personal story of transformation had become a powerful teaching tool. When I look back at that day, she often told new employees, "I'm grateful for the chance to learn and grow. But more importantly, I'm grateful for the opportunity to help others avoid making the same mistakes." The airline's customer satisfaction scores had risen significantly. Passengers reported feeling more welcome, regardless of their appearance or background. The children of the family involved in the incident had become unofficial mascots for the airline's youth program, helping create guidelines for making young travelers feel safe and respected. In the executive offices, the father reviewed the latest progress reports. Complaint rates about discrimination had dropped dramatically. Employee feedback showed a more inclusive workplace culture. Even the stock price had risen as the public responded positively to the airline's commitment to change. The mother worked closely with the HR department, ensuring that the training wasn't just a one-time thing. They developed ongoing education programs, regular workshops, and anonymous feedback systems where employees could report concerns without fear of retaliation. Social media continued to track the airline's progress. The original viral video had led to a series of positive stories about real change in the industry. Other companies began reaching out, asking for advice on implementing similar programs in their own organizations. One day, the flight attendant received an unexpected email. Another airline had invited her to speak at their annual conference about her experience and the importance of confronting unconscious bias. As she prepared her presentation, she realized how far she'd come from that day in the jet bridge. The training center continued to evolve, adding new programs and adapting to feedback. They created special sessions for handling sensitive situations, cultural awareness workshops, and even brought in experts to discuss the historical context of discrimination in travel. Most importantly, the changes weren't just on paper. Real stories of positive interactions began to replace tales of bias and discrimination. Employees spoke proudly about their role in creating a more inclusive environment. The airline had transformed from a source of viral outrage into a model for corporate responsibility and change. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, the airline's largest conference room was filled to capacity. The father stood at the podium, looking out at faces that represented every level of the company, from baggage handlers to board members. On the screen behind him, a single phrase glowed: 1 year of change. "When my family boarded that flight a year ago," he began, We never imagined it would lead to this moment. He gestured to the flight attendant, who now sat confidently in the front row. What could have been just another viral video of discrimination became something much more powerful, a catalyst for real change. The mother joined him at the podium, opening a folder filled with impressive statistics. Customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs. Reports of discrimination had dropped by 95%. Employee retention had improved significantly, and job applications had doubled, especially from minority candidates who saw the airline as a leader in inclusive practices. Their children sat in the audience, no longer the uncertain young passengers from that day. The older one had started a youth advisory board, helping the airline understand how to make young travelers of all backgrounds feel welcome. The younger one had become the face of a new children's program teaching early travelers about respect and inclusion. The flight attendant took the stage next, her transformation evident in her confident stance. "A year ago, I was the problem," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Today, I'm part of the solution." She shared stories of the hundreds of employees she trained, each one leaving with a deeper understanding of their own biases and the power to change. In the audience, other airlines' representatives took notes. The training program had become a model for the entire industry. Airlines worldwide were adopting similar approaches, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the travel sector. A video montage played on the screen, showing highlights from the year. Diverse groups of employees learning together, passengers sharing positive experiences, other companies implementing similar programs. The original viral video appeared briefly, now transformed from a moment of shame into a turning point for positive change. The father introduced their newest initiative, a scholarship program for minority students interested in aviation careers. "Real change isn't just about fixing problems," he explained. "It's about creating opportunities." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. An elderly passenger who had witnessed the original incident was invited to speak. "I've been flying for 50 years, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The change I've seen in this past year gives me hope for my grandchildren's future." The flight attendant shared her own news. She had been promoted to head of the new division of inclusive customer experience. Her journey from that difficult day to her new role served as powerful proof that growth and change were possible. Social media buzzed with the anniversary coverage, but this time, the viral story wasn't about discrimination. It was about transformation. #AviationForAll and #FlyingTogether trended as people shared their own positive experiences with the airline. As the ceremony concluded, the father made one final announcement. The airline was launching an industry-wide initiative, partnering with other carriers to create universal standards for inclusive service. "What happened to my family was not unique," he said, "but how we responded to it can be." The day ended with a group photo of the original flight attendant standing proudly with the family, symbolizing how far they'd all come. In the background, a new company slogan shone brightly: "Everyone's welcome above the clouds." The incident that could have torn people apart had instead brought them together, creating lasting change in an industry that touched millions of lives every day.